I've been using the ROG Allly daily since I got it, and I've been having a blast. It plays all of the games that I want, with some compromises here and there, but I often find myself looking at the expansion port on the top wondering what it would be like if this weren't limited by an iGPU. And thanks to ROG for letting me borrow the thing that plugs into that port, I can finally find out. So that brings us to this beast, which is the XG Mobile. Essentially, the XG Mobile is an iGPU solution that ROG created for their products with a proprietary connector. The main benefit of this solution is that it has much higher bandwidth than Thunderbolts and USB 4.0. Typically, eGPU solutions will use desktop class GPUs, but this one uses a mobile one. Even though it is a laptop GPU, it's the top of the line mobile GPU on the market today. That is also why this thing is almost equivalent to the cost of 3 Allys. So why would you want something like this? Beyond getting a ridiculous boost in your gaming performance, you're also going to be able to get a bunch of additional ports. It's kind of unfortunate that Allly only has a single USB port. Steam Deck notwithstanding, the other things that this competes with have 2 or 3. If we ignore the bump in performance, we get a lot of I/O with this. We gain gigabit LAN, HDMI 2.1, DP 1.4, 3 USB 3.2 ports, and a 3.2 Type-C port. Outside of that, you also have an SD card slot, but that isn't really that useful on Allly since we already have a micro SD card slot. This is really only useful if you were maybe doing some video editing and you needed to dump some video files onto the device. The back of the XG Mobile has a little flap that allows you to prop this up on your desk so you can use it with your Allly. There are 3 versions of the XG Mobile, and this one is the highest end version, and it's kind of nuts. Let's quickly go over some specs. The XG Mobile 4090 comes with a GeForce RTX 4090 laptop GPU with 16 gigabytes of GDDR6. It has 9,728 CUDA cores and a TGP of 150 watts. With the available boost in Armory Crate, we can get a max base clock of 2.5 GHz and a max memory clock of 2.3 GHz. Needless to say, this is a beast. Before we do anything with the XG Mobile, I want to show you the software that we have, how it functions with this device, and what kind of controls we have over the performance of the GPU. So what you're going to do is take this connector and directly insert it into the top slot. So you line it up and push it into place. This light will light up white. Then you're going to push down the switch to lock it into place. The screen will come up asking you to activate the GPU. When you press OK, it will give you a list of anything that's open using the iGPU. You'll have to stop all of them to be able to continue. Once you do that, it will process the change over to the eGPU for rendering. You'll know that this is active because that white light will turn red. Now this process does seem kind of convoluted. It works better than some of the normal eGPUs that I've used, but it's not as seamless as something like the Switch. We now have some new settings that we can change inside Armory Crate. If we go into the settings menu and then go over to operating mode, you can see that I'm in manual mode right now. Right now, I'm working under manual mode 2, and you can see that our SPL limit goes from 7 to 30 watts. I talked about this before, so I'll just use this time to talk about it now. We do have custom TDP control on this handheld, but we don't have it all the way down to 7 watt TDP across the board. The settings that don't go that low are SPPT and FPPT. Values listed under these will boost your TDP up to around 2 minutes before going down to your SPL value. If you look at those and you bring those down to their minimum values, we have a 15 watt minimum. All of these would need to go down to 7 to improve battery life, or ideally, all of them would need to go down to 5 watts, but that's a topic for a different video. I have 53 watts set for the fast boot, and for some reason, I can't get to this one. Okay, there we go. And now this is 43 watts. So what this will do is it'll boost up to 53 watts for a short duration, and then it will go down to 43 watts. After the boost duration is over, it will go down to 30 watts, and it should stay there as long as we have enough load. To handle this TDP, and to make sure we don't have any throttling in this video, I'm going to go down to the fan settings, and I'm just going to increase this entire range to 100% so we get a best case scenario in this video. Now let's continue to the XG Mobile. We have 2 new things here, but we unfortunately do not have any control over the amount of power that this is using. It will just use a max of 150 watts. I tested out the overclocking functionality of this to see if it works, and it does. I'm going to max these values out for the rest of this video, but right now I have the base clock and the memory clock set to these values. When it comes to the fans, we can come in here and boost this if we want. The XG Mobile should not thermal throttle using the default settings, but I'm just going to come in here and set this to 70% fan speed across the board just to be sure. We're going to apply this now by pressing on the checkbox. I know this is working because the fans on both devices are pretty loud right now, but it's fine and I wouldn't be able to hear them if I had headphones on. The system view now lists the increased fan speeds for the Alley and they rate this at 41 dB, which is much louder than stock, but the XG Mobile fans at 70% dwarf Alley, and even though it's a bit off screen to the corner right now, it's a lot louder than Alley. I want to point out that you can use XG Mobile without an external screen just fine. However, if you want to take full advantage of the extra performance of the 4090, you're going to want to use a high resolution monitor or a high refresh rate monitor. This cable is a bit short, so you may not have a lot of room on your desk to move it around. I think this is kind of like a security lock that stores would use on controllers that were hooked up to kiosk consoles. When you use the XG Mobile without an external screen, there should be a small performance hit because of the way that the signal has to travel. Other eGPUs have this bottleneck issue, but it doesn't seem to be that significant on this one. I'll do some benchmarks with and without an external screen to show you the difference in our maximum performance. I also want to point out that I did some modifications to my overlay just for this video to make it easier to see clock speeds, bus load, and throttling conditions. Let's kick things off with some benchmarks, and I want to point out that I started filming this video about 10 days ago. 11 days ago, I got an update for this device that capped my XG Mobile at 115 watts, and I couldn't do anything to fix it. I DDU'd drivers and nothing worked. ROG also didn't seem to have any insight on this issue, so this entire video just sat until I got another 2 updates for Alley on Saturday that also came with a new GeForce driver update that fixed things. If the same thing happens to you and these don't fix it, you might be SOL, but you wouldn't if ROG just added TGB control to Armory Crate. Here's what my 115 watt score was, and here's the normal one. Our graphics score is a bit over 20,000 now, and our CPU also isn't doing that bad at over 10,000. This is with the max boost to base and memory clocks on the 4090. When we run this without an external screen, our graphics score goes down to 19,762, which is around a 2% performance hit. I also went ahead and ran Firestrike Ultra. I got 12,862 for graphics on Alley, but I got 13,387 with an external screen, so that is about a 4% hit. And just to round things out, I ran the Shadow of the Tomb Raider benchmark and I got an average FPS score of 135 using the highest preset at 1080p on Alley, but I got 143 using an external screen. This was the biggest performance hit at just under 6%. Not the end of the world, but it is worth knowing. Because of this, I'm going to film most of the games in this video with an external screen. So our first game in this video is Shadow of the Tomb Raider. I have the resolution set to 4K and I'm using the highest graphics preset. I'm not using any resolution scaling options. As you can see, we're getting great FPS in the jungle. We're also pulling 150 watts on the GPU. This is not typical for every game, but it is for Shadow of the Tomb Raider.
Could be useful. The Silver Crown Mountain. I'm getting closer. Howlers.
Our next game is Horizon Zero Dawn. We're also running this at 4K with the Ultra Quality preset. We don't have any FSR or any upscaling turned on. We're currently capping the frame rate at 60 FPS with VSync on, but I want to disable that to see what kind of performance we could get if we were using a higher refresh rate screen. As you can see, we're at 150 watts almost on the GPU, and we're getting about 70 FPS in the open world. However, when we go into the city, the frame rate drops down to the 40s. Despite this FPS drop, the picture quality is still awesome. When we're in combat, the FPS is much better, which is a lot more important. Even fighting this guy, we have good FPS.
Get the upper hand.
Spider-Man Remastered is a great game to test, and one of the reasons is its support for ray tracing. We're currently running this at 4K with a very high preset. We're not using any resolution scaling options here. When we bump out of this menu, you can see that we're getting around 70 FPS. The only problem with this preset is that the reflections on the window are fake. For example, there's a big building behind me in this window, but when I turn around, there's a small church. If we turn on ray tracing support, we can keep the same preset option. Once this reloads, you'll see that the reflections are now ray traced. The cars also have ray tracing, but it's not always perfect. The only issue is that we don't have enough performance to run this game at 4K with RT on high. It's a huge demand on this GPU, and it's not a lot better if we lowered the resolution to 1080p. It's cool to see, but I wouldn't play this game with RT turned on unless I was using FSR. The FPS is too low, and I'd rather run this at a better FPS with normal reflections. Jedi Survivor is a meme game, but I wanted to test it out anyway. I started the game out at 1440p resolution using the Epic preset and no ray tracing. If you turn on RT with this game, it kind of claws by at 40 FPS. With these settings, we're getting just under 60 FPS. When we go through this area and we jump into combat, we're gonna go down to 50 FPS, but it's still pretty good. This is totally playable. You could lower some settings if you really wanted to hit 60 more often, but a lock 60 doesn't really exist with this port, even with overkill hardware like this. The only problem is that after I got a little further into this, I got a crash message saying that I ran out of memory, so I had to restart the entire game. This doesn't make a lot of sense with 16 gigabytes of GDDR, but whatever. I loaded the game back up again, and this time I used the low preset. We're still at 1440p, but now we're closer to 75 FPS. When we go into combat, we still have some dips down to 50, so that doesn't really seem to change that much. The game is overall a lot smoother and a lot more enjoyable, especially in combat. Now, this did seem like it wasn't going to have any issues. I was playing this game for a while because I liked this game, but when I got over to the ledge here and I went down to jump, ROG got the last laugh. This isn't really their fault though, this is just a bad port. Now let's look at Assassin's Creed Odyssey. This is actually a pretty demanding title at 1080p using the very high preset. This is what I had to use to be able to get 60 FPS in some demanding scenes. You could probably up the resolution a bit higher and get closer to 60 FPS, but I wanted to see 60 FPS regardless of where I was. These are the settings that I needed to use in most areas. This is Far Cry 6 at 4K Ultra settings. Now I have DXR settings turned on, but I'm gonna disable those right now because that brought me down to 50 FPS. With those off, we can get 60 FPS, and we still have a bit of extra headroom on the XG Mobile. We're at 80 to 90% load here, but when we go into the city, it's gonna max out. When that happens, we won't hit 60 FPS, but it's still pretty good. If you didn't have an overlay on, you probably wouldn't know.
Found all your shit, Juan.
Good work, Danny. Now hurry up already. We need to get back to Clara's camp.
That's what I've been saying.
Halo Reach is easier to run, but we're able to max this out at 4K resolution. We will be well over 120 FPS in normal areas, but this will drop down to a bit under 120 FPS when we are in combat.
Enemy dropships inbound.
Our last game is Elden Ring at 4K maximum settings. This thing looks and runs great using these settings on the XG Mobile. You don't really need an XG Mobile for emulation because you already have enough power in here to emulate basically anything that you could want with the iGPU, but we're going to be able to do a lot more with this. For example, we can play demanding PS2 games at 4K resolution, and we could go much higher than 4K if we wanted. If you're going to be limited by anything, it's going to be the CPU before it'll be the GPU. Here we have Xbox emulation with the XMU emulator, and we're at 4X resolution. This looks great, but we still have some lag, especially in games like Panzer Dragoon. For this game, I had to bump down to 2X native. We're not using the GPU that much, so this comes down to the emulator and our CPU. More than anything else, I think where you're going to see the difference in this is going to be in PS3 emulation. And if you can't play a PS3 game on this hardware, then that game must need a supercomputer or it's an emulator issue. This emulator can boot every game, but not every game will run well. But you can play some demanding games like God of War very well on this. And in case you were wondering, we can also upscale Switch games to 4K, no problem. I want to wrap up this video with my thoughts on the XG Mobile and whether or not I would buy one. The XG Mobile that I use in this video is super expensive, but it does expand the functionality of the Alley beyond what we can do with the internal GPU. Before I made this video, I probably would have had the view that all of the XG Mobiles are not worth considering, but I could see myself buying one. Maybe not the 4090, but ROG could have done things to push me in that direction. Let's start with the 4090 and then go to the one model that I would be more comfortable buying. So with the 4090, I would consider buying it under a few conditions. Condition number one would be if I were trying to use this thing as my only PC. The docked performance of the Z1E coupled with the 4090 Mobile is a beast, and even though you could probably build a comparable PC for way less money, it's not the worst option in the world. Even if this were the case for me, I would probably also need to be in the XG Mobile ecosystem already for this to make sense. Ideally, I would own at least one more device that could take advantage of the XG Mobile to spread out the investment. I don't have anything else that can use an XG Mobile, so that brings us to the third point. I would want an attachment or an adapter that would allow the XG Mobile to communicate at lower bandwidth over USB 4 or Thunderbolt. Then I would be able to use this with almost any device that I own, and it would make a lot more sense. This eGPU is well built, and it's easier to transport than other eGPUs that I've used, and I would be willing to pay a premium for added usability. Since those last two things aren't true for me, then I move down to the remaining XG Mobiles. I don't think I would buy the other NVIDIA GPU because the performance isn't that great for the asking price, but I would buy the AMD one. That one is easier to work with, and it would mean that I wouldn't need to deal with changing settings in two different GPU control panels. It's still expensive, but the price versus performance is not that bad compared to other solutions that are on the market. The added bandwidth of the XG Mobile allows the AMD SKU to punch higher than bandwidth-starved Thunderbolt docks, so that's an added benefit. As a fan of the Alley, my only gripe with the XG Mobile is that the connector is a little short, and that means I cannot use Alley connected to an eGPU in the same way that I can with Thunderbolt docks on competing devices. I imagine this cable is this short due to signal integrity issues, but if that weren't the case, this thing should be at least double the length that it is, and it probably should not be connected to the end that exhausts air because that makes for strange arrangements when you're using this with Alley. But those are my thoughts on the 4090 XG Mobile. I'll have links to this one and the one that I recommend down below. If you enjoyed this video and you want to take a look at another, feel free to take a look at my recent video on an overclocked 7840HS mini PC. Happy gaming everyone, Taki out.